Welcome everyone to whatever season it is in the town that you live in. Seems like we have
So true.
a couple of seasons going on. I told Debbie earlier today that time zones were giving me anxiety, and so I was like, well, when I'm a rich old lady and I have villas all over the world, they all have to be in Central Standard Time. But I was realizing that was like every season this year, like every season in the Central Time Zone this year. All right.
Yeah.
So on the serious note, we are talking about documentation. And so we are in a line of work where we often say the mantra document, document, document. And I think we need to acknowledge, as people who often say that, that sometimes documentation cuts both ways. So we're going to talk about documentation becoming evidence. And nothing we're going to talk about today will land in the place where it says you should be doing more documentation. We just want to give perspective on what this looks like by a third party, by perspective of what this looks like a year later, what it looks like, in this way and in that way. So again, the idea is not to make more work for anybody, but maybe we can be smarter about what we do because documentation is super important and it does cut both ways. So, with all of that said, let's kick this off. Oh, later I'm going to send out a poll. I'll do it towards the end. And I would appreciate if the attendees would participate in that. So this first question, I guess Sarah, and maybe I'll just ask these questions. You guys can jump in. Sarah, as a graduated litigator, not former litigator, but graduated litigator. Um, so, Amber and Lindsay, and I'll chime in a little bit more too, people who have gone through litigation with documentation that we did or didn't create, um, being that other people often creates it for us. The question I was going to ask Brian, but I'll ask you guys all to put on your Brian hats, is when an employment dispute ends up in front of an investigator or a judge. So again, that could be an equal employment opportunity investigator. It could be another agency's investigator or a judge. Um, those investigators and judges are not there to talk about the investigation. They're just looking at it. They're just looking at the paper trail. So maybe Sarah, can you just kick us off on sort of procedurally walking us through a company's own documentation when it becomes the evidence that's being used against us and we are the ones that created it? How can we say, well, no, that's not what that was supposed to say?
Yeah.
Um,
So usually the first step is they're going to ask you for a really broad request, essentially ask you for any records you have on the subject of whatever's come up, whether it's a litigation, an employment law matter in front of a federal agency, or just an investigation like the ones that Lindsay does. So just know what your own records say. And if they're silent, be prepared to talk about it because that's probably going to come up in depositions and things like that. And if you're making any controversial decision, I always advise clients to write like a quick memo to file saying, this is the position we took. This is the reasonable reason behind it or justification, just showing like, hey, we were thinking, we weren't just, sporadically doing things. But yeah, know what your documents say. If you documented something, be aware of it. It's probably going to come later.
Sarah, you're making me wonder, do people remember like, oh no, this is what we were thinking? Or is it a lot of times that person, that manager's not here anymore? Or
Yeah.
honestly, I thought I did something else and I can't find it.
Yeah, a lot of times you have your standard employee turnover stuff, or they've used different business advisors or bookkeepers, or there are different people that factored into this decision making. And so when they get audited, or when an agency asks questions, or when a litigation matter comes up, then the people are like, well, we don't know. We know what position we took. We have no idea why we did it. And then your whoever's representing you in that new matter is going to have to recreate like what the justification is so they can build out an argument and help you. But it just is so much easier if you take like the quick couple minutes just to document thinking, whether it's like note transcriptions from a call where you made the decision, even if it's not like a formal memo or just something in your file. So if the important person gets hit by a bus, you know why you made a certain decision.
Amber, what do you think? You're the one that's usually holding people's hands when they're doing this documentation, or hopefully people are asking you to hold their hands.
Yeah, so when I talk to a lot of managers, they say, Well, but this has been going on for 6 months. I have 3 months ago, I have a Slack message, I have a Teams message, whatever it may be. And I think being timely, being consistent, and making sure that it goes in line with other documentation that you have. What else can you have other than that? Positive reviews. You just got a merit increase. You got your full 3%. Your manager's telling you in one-on-ones that you're doing well, but at the same time, there's no written coaching. Is there consistency there? Is it timely? I always tell people do it right when it happens. If you make it become a practice and you say, okay, what policy did they not follow? What can we do to document as it goes? Because you're not going to remember. I don't remember what I did, last month in certain conversations. So when they look at that, they're not going to say, what did the manager mean? They're going to say, what does the documentation show in the
Mhm.
timeline of this?
Yep. Yep.
Hey,
Yep.
investigator Lindsay, I know you have a comment here because you
Well, and
are not an external investigator. You are, I guess you are, you're not an internal investigator, but you're a third party neutral hired by the employer. You are external to the situation. And all this black and white documentation lands on your desk. And different than when a court or an agency comes in, you have a parallel process of asking questions and trying to get to the crux of the matter, which the court does otherwise. But there's also this other party trying to make sure the truth doesn't, gets colored this way, that. But you're in there trying to find the truth of the matter. You are the investigator, and all this documentation lands on your desk. And I know because I've been sitting with you when it, just like Amber says, positive review, positive review, positive review. And people are like, this
yeah.
guy's been a jerk for years.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's often like, especially for a lot of clients we have right now, and just kind of perpetually, they're the cases that come to us are often have a level of complexity because they've been previously internally investigated. There are often really deep histories that are associated. And just the point you made, Natalie, oftentimes we see omissions in documentation because there aren't good, there's a lot of reasons for it, but there aren't good habits built or good practices that have been ingrained. And Amber alluded to some memory related issues that I think about deeply from a psychological perspective, because I think we all have this like misnomer about how memory actually works, that a lot of times people think like an event happens, we record it, and then we go file it away in the back of our brain so that we can access it later. And really, that's not how it works. And that's what the science tells us, that when we try to retrieve memories, and I know as a parent trying to do this, that it gets complicated because we don't have a photographic memory. It's not just as easy as going into that file and replaying what happened, because what happens when we try to retrieve is that we are actually constantly revising memories to fill in blanks that exist. So we're filling in those blanks with newer context that might be coming to bear, or our biases that exist. And so a theme of what you're going to hear from me today on this documentation piece is the importance of building habits that have you documenting immediately, so that we are not in a constant state of revising those memories. Because when it comes to a court situation, if we are providing ad hoc documentation, timestamps are going to be really important. And if we're providing ad hoc documentation, that creates not only a credibility problem for the manager or the witness reporting the information, who's being questioned about it, but a liability problem for the organization. And so, you don't ever want to put your managers or your organization in the position of having to like lean on, well, I didn't mean to misrepresent what happened as your defense. Like, intention kind of doesn't matter here. And so creating good habits um, that that encourage, incentivize your managers to document things when they happen is really important. Even if, as Sarah was mentioning, it's a cursory note to file, it's a line item in a spreadsheet, like whatever it looks like, at least it's being captured in as real time as possible. And I'm actually reminded of a practice that one of my son's teachers has engaged in over the years that he's had her. And I noticed this too with my older child who had her previously. She's like a 30-year like highly tenured teacher. And whenever we take her a gift for teacher appreciation or Christmas or whatever, she immediately writes the thank you note. And I think that is such a practice that we can all kind of think about using in our lives, because
she doesn't forget what he brought. She has something meaningful to say about, how she connects to it. She sends it home that day. And so I think that's a lesson that we can all learn
I'm
from.
going to bounce back to you, Lindsay. But Sarah, something that strikes me, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on this too. Um, you and I learned the rules of evidence, and you actually use them. And Lindsay's here talking about this new age science of what science tells us about how our memory fills in gaps and things like that. But the rules of evidence predate our country and, go back to England and, they got it from other places. And the idea of sort of a contemporary outburst or a dying wish. All of that sort of intrinsic, knowledge of justice and wisdom of when things are real got captured and codified in some of our evidence codes. It's interesting to think about sort of these old school archaic rules relating to HR's documentation problems and Lindsay's discussion of modern neuropsychology. Do you have any, I wonder if you have any reactions to that, and I'll jump back to Lindsay about another question.
Lindsay's commentary, it reminded me of the game of telephone that you play in school, how you see how distorted the message gets over time. And I think your memory really is like that. And just going back to the rules of evidence, even if things don't meet like your standard rules for admittance, you can offer a lot of stuff for impeachment purposes. So a lot of times what I'd see in these, we didn't document things, we just kept it all in our heads situation, is you get a lot of weird stuff offered for impeachment purposes, and it turns into a messy he said, she said, and just gets a lot messier than it needs to be. Whereas if you just had a time-stamped record from when it happened that wasn't distorted through time, like it just wraps things up so much easier.
As an investigator, I get so excited when I have a record that shows me the contemporaneous nature of what happened. So whenever a reporting party tells me, yeah, I reported this to HR 3 months ago, and I followed up with an email, I'm like, yes, I have this email and it's consistent with what you just told me. Like that really does help build the credibility and cuts the other way in terms of making that witness unimpeachable, at least on that issue. So contemporaneous documentation is like one of the things I get most excited about as an investigator.
Yeah.
Amber looks so satisfied in this moment.
And I would also bring up, just don't try to make yourself look good in the documentation, because that creates a lot of issues too. If in the contemporaneous documentation you're like, man, I look kind of bad here, so you like put a different spin on it, try really hard not to put a spin on it, because that just throughout time it causes a lot more issues. Like for example, like if you look at text messages, anybody could go through any text conversation in their phone and screenshot one message and it would look like just really bad. So context is always important.
I'm gonna ask Lindsay something else sort of off script that we see a lot of. Lindsay, what is the sort of IO analysis of why, Amber, don't cringe here. Why do people get great reviews every year when everybody hates particular behaviors about them? Like, what is
Because
it about managers that you can't give people a negative critique sometimes?
there's a lot of things going on there, but a lot of times it's the root of it is conflict avoidance. That somehow if I ignore a problem or I pretend a problem doesn't exist or I conclude that it's a one-off, that it's just going to fix itself. And I mean, let's just acknowledge the fact that managers are busy. And so if it's anything outside of the routine, outside of normal, outside of like what the hottest priority is, it's really easy to deprioritize the need to document or to provide in the moment feedback to correct behaviors. So it can be conflict avoidance. It can be a lack of training and we see that often, actually, that contributes to poor performance evaluation practices. It also is our tendencies to, there's a couple of things happening. One thing is referred to as the halo effect, that if something is, if there's some positivity that is kind of more recent than any negative behaviors that have happened, we'll have a tendency to color all of our present impressions. So if that employee just landed a massive sale, or if that employee just contributed positively to the team in some other kind of way, that will tend to color our global evaluations of their performance, when in reality, if we have been documenting and if we have been providing feedback along the way, yes, they should get credit for that good thing they just did, but it certainly should not negate any of the other salient performance related issues that need to be managed. And so there's some things going on there, a leniency effect too, that we have just by human nature, that we want to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Amber, I want to transition to you, but I'm curious, do you have any sort of remedies or even warnings about this phenomenon that Lindsay's talking about, where we just don't like giving negative feedback? How does this land in your world?
I think it's a little bit easier too, because if you wait till the end of the year, you're looked at almost as a bad manager because they're going to be surprised by this, right? If you haven't had one-on-ones, you haven't had quarterly conversations, and then all of a sudden at the end of the year, a lot of times companies might base their merit increases on this and things, and all of a sudden you're like, you haven't been meeting expectations, but in your one-on-ones, you're telling them they're doing fine. I think there's a difference between communication and feedback, and I think Lindsay mentioned training, and I love that. I think a lot of managers are promoted because they're good operationally. Maybe they were a good independent contractor. Go. They were a good independent contributor, and then they're transition into a manager role. So they might say, "Well, man, you need to do better on this." That is completely different than saying, "This is what the issue was. This is when it occurred, and this is our expectations that you're not meeting." I think that's different. And so I think to answer your ultimate question, if you're doing some of that throughout the year and you do it progressively, so maybe at first it's just like, yeah, man, you should do this. And then it's like, okay, you're still not doing this. You're much likely to be able to give that feedback annually.
Yeah, and I think the employee should be surprised and is right to be a little irritated that they've never been given the opportunity to know how they're actually being evaluated.
Yeah,
They should be upset about never having that. I mean, that's a failing on the manager's,
that's right.
owner, the supervisor's part for never giving that person the opportunity to have critique or opportunity to improve.
Yeah.
All right, Amber, I'm sticking with you. Talk to me about what a well-documented personnel decision looks like, versus when you find one where, most files are either empty or only have these like cursory positive things in it, and then we need to do something perceived as a negative adjustment. What gaps do you talk to people about? And just generally, how do we recover it, and how do we not get ourselves in a situation of having poorly documented personnel files?
I think when I look through personnel files, because again, I'm going to go back to, well, I can dig through this and I can find this message, and it's not really what we're looking for. This is the expectations. There's no follow-up. There's no measurable. If it's just an opinion of someone, if it's sales, can it be measurable? Follow through. So I think a lot of times it's very reactive. And so I think we've mentioned a lot on here, and you're right, I did love that, where it's timely, where it's documented. If it's not in there, having to go back, but trying to get on a cadence of making that timely and having it as a habit is just going to help. And I think you're going to have to go through as a company or managers or different situations of things where it's really a pain to have to dig all this stuff out and put together puzzle pieces of this. If you just have it, go get those now, have a manager do it. Know that's the expectation when you come to a manager, HR, whatever, get all of that stuff. And again, that comes back to training them that that's important. Anything that they can have, just if you need it in the future, um, is important.
Yeah, I do think it's that maybe that cadence piece that just as humans we're so resistant to.
Well, and I would just point out something I think Sarah said earlier, and that is that people turn over. You might not have those managers by the time a complaint is being litigated, especially because the long lead times on litigation are so significant. And so you may not only might you be in the position of trying to create ad hoc documentation based on faulty memory? It might be worse than that, and that memory is not even available to you anymore. And so so having these contemporaneous practices are just so important for so many reasons.
Yeah. And contemporaneous communication of expectations is really important because uncommunicated expectations always lead to conflict. Because when an employee gets surprised and it's tied to like a monetary thing, they're going to get mad and they're going to look at different venues they can, complain about you in. And just, it's really easy to contemporaneously be like, hey, here's the expectation. This might not have been communicated clearly prior to this moment, but I wanted to have a conversation with you now. And it also helps you develop that employee so they can become a better fit for your company and be a sticky employee. So you don't have to be in the constant loop of training and trying to catch people up and that whole scenario.
All right, let's talk about a scenario without naming any names. So an employee reports to a man, I'm sorry, a poor employee complains about a manager. 6 months later, different employee complains about the same manager. 6 months later, we get another complaint from another person about that same manager. I want to ask each of you from the chairs you sit in, what situation is that employer in when we've either done nothing or nothing effective with that manager? When we now have three complaints over the span of years from different employees about the same or similar behavior. Amber, what did you hear in that scenario that I just set up?
Oy. So, what did the company know? And then what did they do about it? So, at the end of everything, I always advise, people that I talk to or clients to document what you did. So, say it was in a sexual nature. Did you do a sexual harassment training? Whatever it may be, are you going to do a follow-up check-in? Is it 3 months, 6 months? Normally, training is good. I know we keep mentioning that, but that goes a long way. So, what did the company know and what did they do about it? Because, I mean, at that first time, my question is, what do we do about it at that point? And it sounds like not a lot, which is not a good thing.
Yeah. What do you think, Lindsay?
I think that this is a situation. My immediate thought was like, how do these complaints keep happening over time? What's the underlying cause for those ongoing complaints? Is it that we didn't do anything, to Amber's point, or is what we did ineffective? Or do we have gaps in our systems that make those prior complaints opaque to the people who need to know about it? Because sometimes what happens in these cases is that now we're on our third complaint, but whoever is managing this complaint doesn't have visibility into the prior complaints. And so do we have systems that give the right people the right access to the history of information? Or do you have someone asking the right questions about the history of complaints? And so sometimes what we see happen by the time it comes to us as an external is that internal investigator took in a complaint, but it was deemed to be not a big deal. And so we just tucked it away over here. And then new HR manager comes in and gets the second complaint and doesn't have any visibility into the first complaint or knowledge that there even was one. And so by the time it comes to me, reporting parties are like, yeah, I complained about that a year and a half ago, or yeah, I've been complaining about that for a year and a half, but it went to this HR manager the first time and this one the second time. And so making sure that your systems are integrated enough so that the right people have the visibility they need into this history and into the history of what's been done or not done in response to them.
Right, from an evidence perspective, because we're talking about documentation, Sarah, what did you hear when I gave you that scenario?
Pattern of conduct. And anytime you have a pattern, that's when really bad things start to happen. It's like the quote that George Bush tried to use where he messed up, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you, or the other way around. See, I messed it up just like him. But after you do it more
right.
than
No, you didn't. No, you
fool
didn't.
me once, yeah. But anytime there's more than one mistake, it's like, okay, so like what's going on here and that gap and the patterns, it's just yeah.
Well,
Bad.
I mean, from evidence, business pattern and practice is a standard of evidence. Is it your business pattern and practice to disregard this kind of complaint?
because our documentation or our lack of it would demonstrate that it is.
And even if you have this beautiful policy like in place, if you can, establish a pattern where you're obviously disregarding this, it just opens you up to a whole wider scope of liability, because you had this beautiful policy that you talked to counsel about, and then just life happened, you got busy, and it just kind of went out the window. You thought it was a one-off event. Sometimes the spacings throw people off too, and employers are genuinely surprised when a pattern of conduct is created, because they're like, didn't put that together, whether it's like a turnover issue, so it's not the same face as seeing it, or but it can expose the same cracks in your system over and over again.
Yep. Again, one of those, we were talking about the wisdom of courts of days gone by, the ancient court wisdom. And this is one of them, that your patterns show who you really are more than your decisions in the moment. All right. Sarah, I'm going to stick with you. So we were talking about employees. Let's talk about independent contractors, because those are contracts with vendors who are not employees. And so on the employee side, we have things like offers letters, and over with vendor and, evaluations over here. And then with vendors, we just have contracts. Talk to me about when those contracts age. I know one of the things that I hate seeing is like, oh, well, over the years, we just started giving them an annual review too. Or over the years, we just started giving our independent contractors an annual increase also. But that's not how a contract works. Sarah, talk to me about when our independent contractor contracts age, and should we even have old independent contractor contracts?
Yeah, so this one trips a lot of people up. A lot of times you'll see like a very broad contract that's super informal. They might have written it themselves, and it just has like perpetual renewal terms. It doesn't have clear, like, hey, this is when we update things. It just doesn't have any of the checks that you'd have in a more formal contract. And then outside of the actual contract language, you then have like, well, how is the relationship with this third party managed? And a lot of times when you'd have the people interacting with this person on a daily basis have no idea what the contract says, because that's purely in the legal department, or it's sitting in another bureaucratic department, but the people on the ground have no idea. So they just treat them like one of the guys, and it muddies the waters a lot. In a perfect world, I like to see independent contractor agreements structured more like a master service agreement that has these big overarching terms, and then you do something called a statement of work on a monthly or whatever basis makes sense to you, and that statement of work has the price and all the important terms that need to be looked at very frequently. And it also can help you document, hey, we are not treating them as an employee. This is a project-based relationship. They haven't just been integrated into the company and their paperwork sloppy, kind of thing. So master service agreement, statement of work, they're your friends. And then let the people know who interact with them, like kind of the boundaries for what that relationship is supposed to look like. Because most of the times when those mistakes happen, it's not out of maliciousness or anything like that. It's just they don't know what they don't know because it hasn't been communicated.
Yeah, and Amber, I'll get to you in a second because I know you have something to say here. But Lindsay, we talk about culture and culture fit, and sometimes our contractors are really important to our output and our wins and our who we are. Um, how can we have good teams where some people are legitimately treated separately when we're also never supposed to treat anybody differently?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's a lot of times it boils down to the language that we use. I think about two things in regards to building teams that are a combination of employees and independent contractors. And I think first and foremost, when you are engaging with independent contractors, you have to select those contractors in a way that is similar to the way you select your employees. The terms of those agreements and how you work together are going to be a little bit different, but being thoughtful and intentional about the extent to which the contractors you select are aligned with you from sort of a values and a cultural perspective is really important. So asking good questions of your vendors or your contractors around the extent to which they're going to integrate from that perspective is going to be important. But also, I don't and Sarah, tell me if I'm stepping in it here, but I don't think hiring a contractor means we don't performance manage them. We just don't call it performance management. We call it's terms of service, it's service level agreements, it's what metrics are you going to evaluate their continued service on, and those are contractual items that sometimes develop over time, and then lead to a contract modification, or that you know in advance because you have enough experience with these kinds of contractors to know what kind of service you need to get from them. And if they aren't providing the level of service, much in the way you might performance manage an employee, sometimes those relationships run their course and you don't renew contracts or you end contracts early. And that is a method of performance management with contractors.
Yeah, the key there is to make sure that your scope of work is really well defined. So a lot of times when people attempt to document these statements of work on their own, they have super broad tasks and expectations. In a perfect world, you have metrics tied to each of those expectations in the project. You have spoken deadlines, you have things like that. And then your master service agreement would have dispute provisions and how you like escalate certain disagreements so you don't have to go to litigation. And the main idea is that needs to be contractually controlled. You just can't start treating these independent contractors like they're one of your employees and using those documented contracts. You have to make sure you're tying it back to the contract. And lots of times people get confused. They have even if they have a contract written in, it's excellent, they just don't use it and they use their employee metrics and it gets messy.
All right, Amber, talk to us, because one of the things that I'm hearing in here, Sarah's talking about let's write contracts with measurable measurables and let's hold people accountable to measurable measurables. And Lindsay's talking about let's get, vision aligned and mission aligned and culture aligned, even with our contractors. And I'm like, we hire contractors because we don't have that skill in-house. We are a law firm. If I need to hire an IT engineer, like a systems engineer, it is because that is not what we do here. And that is culturally and by personality type not likely to be a person who's wired the same as the people on this call. So Amber, fix it. How do we fix all this?
I think, watching, I know we were talking about documentation, and I had a excellent call with one of our clients on this week. And, we were able to kind of talk through this. And, on the surface, it looked like maybe this person could be a 1099 and just asking some really good questions. But, in terms of documentation, some things I look for that just kind of make me cringe a little bit. If you have a company org chart, they should not really be on said org chart. If it's an internal title that goes on your, you abandoned grades and you're putting them in one of those, director of different things, email signatures that looks like a permanent email. Gosh, just so many things where if someone were to look in on the outside and they're like, I can't tell, that's an issue because
Yep.
you think you're bringing them in and you're being inclusive, all these things, but then, all hands meetings, that's another thing I've seen, or adding them to certain systems, rewards and recognition systems. I think you can still have those metrics like I just talked about without doing some of those really key things that someone on the outside is like, I don't know if this is an employee. It doesn't matter if you have this contract on the side. Everything else points to this person being an employee on paper.
Those documented artifacts that look a whole lot like an employee versus a contractor.
Yes.
And actually, Natalie, it's interesting that you bring up the point about the way, I'm thinking about how contractors have been used in our own firm when we have a need for that. And I think sometimes you don't have to worry about values alignment if that individual is going to not be integrated into your team. Sometimes that's just not necessary. And like, you hire contractors all the time who only you engage with because that's all that's needed for them to provide the service to the firm. And they don't show up at our team meetings, or they don't, have integration in other ways. And sometimes you just don't need to integrate them. And good contractors won't feel any kind of way about that, right? Because they're a contractor for a reason and they have multiple clients that they're serving and they're not integrated into teams. And keeping them at arm's length from your teams can be a really important way to manage those relationships so that an outsider looking in won't mistake them for an employee.
Would you
Yeah.
like to manage our contractor?
No, that's above my pay grade, Natalie.
And going back to the metrics that we use for these contractors, so a lot of times whenever I'm representing the contractor side of it, it's really about us adequately articulating what services we are going to provide to someone that may not be in the same industry as we are, just so we actually have a meeting of the minds. They actually understand what we're doing, and that's the contractor's best risk management step, is to make sure they can articulate the great things they're doing. And sometimes it is really hard to articulate the value add in certain situations, especially in highly technical industries. And I have one specific client that does a lot of like techie stuff that I've had to have a couple regroups with them, be like, okay, explain to me what exactly we're doing. But yeah, just having them articulate it in a way that you understand, and making sure before they start work on that statement of work, you understand what they're doing, can be like the best thing there for both sides.
Yeah, I think something that I've used and work with Lindsay more often maybe than work with you, Sarah, but I'm realizing it's sort of same, is saying things like, if I can't write about this in a way that a judge can comprehend it, we haven't gotten anywhere.
Mhm.
So tell me what it is you're doing and tell me what it is you expect in words that even a judge could understand. All right, Sarah, sticking to documentation, what if we do fancy departmental and maybe even different LLCs? What if we put our contractors in an LLC and our employees over in a corporation, or we, have all of our different things doing different things, but really it's only on paper.
Yeah.
Does that keep
So,
us safe?
org charts can make things messy and can confuse a lot of people. So it's really making sure that once you've articulated a plan for how your org chart's going to work, you actually follow it. So one of the main things that I notice when I step in is I see like this org chart. It can be completely beautiful or have some issues, and I talk with the person that set it up and I can see how it's supposed to function. And then you check in with the person, they're like, yeah, I'm not using it that way. And that disconnect, then you have this like beautiful structure, it's not being used that way. It creates like unnecessary just mess and confusion everywhere. But one of the structures, if it's actually followed, that can be helpful is you'll have the separate entity that has your organization's secret sauce, what you really care about that you don't want to be taken away if you were to get sued, has your IP, has all your things like that. And you segregate it from your operating entity. And usually the operating entity is the one that hires the employees, and it's the one that has the relationships with the vendors. Usually you don't see vendors and employees separated, unless you're doing like an intercompany type of agreement where you have like this big family of entities, and you want to have an administrative services type company provide admin services, like have the phone contract and things like that with all your different sub
Mhm.
entities. That's one of the situations where I have seen like that one entity does have the contractor relationships. And then it's just making really sure that you have the right intercompany documentation, and the right permissions in that vendor contract, so they know like, hey, we are a big family of companies and this is how we're dispersing services. So then they can't come back and like try to change your rates or anything like that, because a lot of times those vendor salespeople, they'll get really confused if you don't just have like a simple picture where you're like, hey, this is what we're doing, this is our admin services contract, this is how we're providing services to our big family of companies, and just keeping them in the loop from the beginning. But always a good idea to separate your IP and stuff from your operating entities.
Let's talk about evidence that nobody thought of as being evidence. So Slack messages, AI musings, text exchanges, things that are so informal and sometimes happen off company equipment. Sarah, can you talk to us about evidence standards of some of that sloppiness? It's like it just kind of gets to be everywhere, right?
Yeah. So a lot of people get super informal in their text communications, things like that. I think you just need to let people know, like if you have a company system, you have an company account, you let people know that those messages are going to be monitored. Sometimes you'll find people get sloppy and start sending personal things from like company related messaging services, and then they get mad when their personal data is leaked in and HR is talking to them about it. It's like, why did you do that? Um, and people should just understand the privacy that they're giving up when they use these employer-based messaging services. And we should also have a way that we're logging things. If you want to get super big brother, you can flag things that are particularly alarming, but it really depends on the involvement you want. But just know there is a history, and employees should know there is a history, and that if you need to find something, IT can find it.
Well, I think it's so tricky because tools like Slack or Teams messages or even text messages, have WhatsApp, whatever, have really become the new water cooler, right? Especially as, I know there's a return to work push in a lot of places, but that has not actually eliminated the need for these sort of text-based communication channels. And as a result, people come to view Slack and whatnot as a place to share jokes or to just connect with their coworkers on a social level. And that didn't get captured electronically, literally around the water cooler days, right? But it does now. And so I think we have to think, being the cultural person on the team, I do think about these as valuable tools for building, sustaining, and maintaining relationships among employees that are really important key elements to how our teams work together, how they build relationships with one another. But being sensitive to some guardrails that maybe we need to make sure we're implementing so that things don't get out of hand and don't become evidence or salient evidence in any case in litigation down the road.
And I'm thinking of one particular case.
I bet we're thinking about the same case from
yeah.
Where
and
the
that
evidence
one
isn't really organized. Like it's hard to get we got the evidence, but like making use of it, it's, I mean, it's just icky. But I'm sorry, Sarah, what were you gonna say?
I was going to bring up the one particular client that's been keeping Brian busy a lot. And I mean, we had former employees forwarding emails from another company that they set up in direct competition to their like our company email serve. And then surprised we had all this data. And you get people doing like blatant situations like that where it's not just, making, talking crap about a manager. It's like literally doing activities in violation of their employment agreements and forwarding evidence to company records or doing it on company laptops where IT can recover those records. And then they act surprised.
I was actually thinking of a different one that's keeping Brian up, where they tried to self-help a little bit and the forensics all got destroyed, but they had a former client coming in under our current username after they left and just underbidding everything by a little bit, just enough to win the work. But because they tried to engage in some self-help, again, the forensics are there, but it's sloppy and nasty because they moved it all. They monkeyed with it. And so I mean, they have been truly wronged and they're going to have a really icky time because they just kind of disregarded their communication methods and what their servers and systems and practices allowed to come in. Okay, we're running out of time, but I want to talk real quickly. What's too much? So on the other hand, we've had clients that you get instantaneous big brother messagings when you do a naughty thing, or weekly reviews of your performance, or micromanagement out the wazoo, and that gets even weirder in remote work situations. But what is the measure of too much? How do I measure micromanagement? Like what's the difference between lots of management and micromanagement? Where are those lines, ladies?
Well, I'll jump in before someone else takes my answer. I think that we do see clients who have the best intentions at heart when they are preparing documentation, like their policies and procedures. And there are good reasons sometimes to be really prescriptive and really robust in that level of documentation. But, and Sarah, I think alluded to this earlier, and maybe even Amber too, and that is when we become in our zeal to be the best documenters possible, we oftentimes get too prescriptive, and that breaks down, especially when these things come before court, when in the behavior of the managers who are tasked with following these really prescriptive policies and procedures. And so the more complex, the more steps that there are, the more specific it is, feels good, I think, for the people doing it. It feels like they're reducing risk because they're telling people exactly how to do what they need to do. But it often becomes problematic because people don't know how to follow those policies, build habits that are contrary to those policies and procedures or those prescriptions, and they fail oftentimes in getting the buy-in that they need to actually implement those policies. And so people are going to have, just by human nature, going to have a tendency to rest in policies that are very clear to them, that they understand, that they remember, frankly, and that they believe are reasonable. And if you get too granular in how you want to prescribe people's behavior, all of it goes out the window very easily in just the nature of human behavior.
I feel like one thing that came up to me was when a manager's typically done, they're done, whether it's been happening for 6 months, 8 months, whatever it is. And one of the biggest risk areas is retaliation. And so all of a sudden it can look like retaliation. And all of a sudden, whether it's in sales, pulling accounts, or maybe they don't trust them. But the thing is, why don't you trust them? Where's your documentation? Well, they're inconsistent. And I do feel like we have some smaller clients and they have the best hearts, and those lines sometimes get blurred in terms of like personal boundaries because you are their employer. And so I think some of those lines sometimes can get blurred, and then you've created this relationship where you're talking about personal things and you're doing this and you have this relationship, and then it comes up and you're done, but you've done these things, and so the lines can really get blurred there in a lot of those instances, and you forget about the documentation, and then you just want to overdo it, and it looks almost as if it's retaliation, even though it's not.
Yeah.
The change in management frequency. Yeah, I think we see that a lot.
Yeah.
Sadly. And it's human nature, right? You have a kid that lies to you, you scrutinize their veracity for a little while, right? It's the
Yes.
same thing in the workplace. Somebody isn't performing in a certain way, you scrutinize them for a while, but gosh, that's a thin line between retaliation and, not that it's the topic of this one, but retaliation's the easiest claim in the world. You don't have to have prove up of the underlying condition if you prove the retaliation. So it is dangerous when somebody's cadence of management shifts dramatically. All right, any last thoughts, ladies?
I think I
All
have one.
right. Well, everybody go have whatever kind of day you're having in your planet, with the weather in your planet. I am going to try to stay cool here, or try to stay warm.
My
Thank
fireplace
you.
has been running all week.
Yeah, our fireplace is on right now too.
All right. Thanks to all the attendees. And I guess I'll see you next month. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.